All right, we're back, and it's COMP305, Week 1, Lesson 1, Part 2. And we talked about kind of a syllabus outline in first part. And this part, we're really talking about the 3D environment. And if you were going to kind of learn about the 3D pipeline, if you're going to create games for 3D and 2D, where do you begin? Well, COMP391, what it should have done for you is done two things. Talk about games at a very high level, like different kinds of games, right? So we're talking about multiplayer games, different game styles, and so on. That's really COMP391. And really introduce you to the world of 3D and 2D using some kind of tool, like a game engine like Blender, Unity, whatever, right? So let's talk about the tool sets. So again, when we develop games, we have to have some kind of input tool or asset development tool, like a Blender. Blender is becoming more and more popular. Let's go to that blender.org website for a second again, just to kind of recap. We're at Blender 2.75a, and if you notice, it's quickly evolving. Blender continues to add additional resources, and I kind of hats off to those guys because it's completely an open source community that really supports Blender and puts stuff together for Blender to create 3D stuff, right? So 2.75a. I think Cars was created completely with Blender. The Pixar or Disney movie Cars was kind of put together like that in recent memory. And there's been a lot of other little games that have been put out there. But really, from anything, it's a great learning tool. And from a 3D perspective, being free, it's got lots of power without paying a dime, right? So let's take a look at that for a second and to review some of the concepts from a 3D perspective. So if you don't have Blender, you can certainly download it for blender.org. If you do have Blender, it should be installed in the machine in front of you. And if it's not, I recommend you download and install it now. So we're going to try and do this kind of stuff. A couple things to note. For Blender, you need to have a full keyboard. All right. If you don't have a full keyboard, you can get one of these, which is kind of a little keyboard that we can use alongside. And when I say full keyboard, I mean you need kind of the number pad for it to be effective. Okay. Now, luckily, the machine's in front of you. Okay, but if you're using a laptop, you certainly don't need this. If you don't have a laptop, you can do without, but it makes it hell of a lot easier to do this with the shortcut keys. Now, for people who were with me last time, bear with me. It's going to be a bit of a review. People who are here with me today, and that's most of you, and you haven't done this before, I'm going to go quick, right? So stick with me. And by the way, we're recording this all. So it's not like you can't go back and, if you really care to, look at the video and kind of follow along, all right? All right, so let's talk about 3D a little bit. So I'm going to kick off Blender while you guys are downloading or whatever. Who does not have Blender on the machine in front of them? If you don't have Blender, I'll wait a few minutes, and then we'll start it off. And I'll start talking about the interface while you guys do that. All right, so here's 2.75a Blender. There's a couple of things to note for Blender, right? And we're going to start talking about the interface. Actually, this is the same whether you use Blender, Maya, 3D Studio Max, whatever. There's different, piece parts of the screen that you're going to see. There is a context-sensitive menu on the right-hand side, as well as some kind of drawing interface or stage, if you will, that we're going to be, modeling our objects in the middle of our screen. Okay, we talked about in 391, you should have talked about things like the camera. That would be the camera, which kind of gives you a view. If I press the 0 key on the numpad, right, the 0 key on the numpad, try it out if you load a Blender. If you don't have Blender, load it up. And if you're still waiting, it's okay. But if you press the 0 key on the numpad, it'll take you into camera view like this. And actually, it's a toggle, right? It'll toggle you in and out of camera view, right? What that's doing is it's giving you the perspective of the camera when we press the 0 key, right? That's what it does, okay? If I zoom in, and again, there's different ways of zooming in. If I kind of, you can use the scroll button, the scroll wheel, and again, it's very important to have a 3-button mouse for 3D modeling, especially with Unity and all that kind of stuff. You need a 3-button mouse. So if you don't have one for your laptop and you like using the touchpad, bad for you. You need to get a 3-button mouse, okay? It's not a big investment. You should have turned the lights on, so otherwise you won't be able to see. But you need it to make it go, okay? So when we talk 3D space as a review, right now what we're looking at is the camera view. And if I rotate around the view, if I pan around the view, so to speak, right, here I am, kind of rotating around the view. If you notice now the camera view is kind of shifted off to the other side. There's my camera. And all I'm doing is I'm rotating around this center object, right, in space, in three-dimensional space. And I have these different lines. If you notice, on the left-hand corner here of my screen, right, it's hard to see. Right here I have these, axes that are mentioned right here, right? The y-axis is the green line, the x-axis is the red line, and the z-axis is the blue line, which you can't see right now, right? But when I actually click on an object, remember from a Blender perspective, in order for you to select an object, you have to right-click, right? So I'm right-clicking the object. If you do that, you see that there is a manipulator arm that kind of comes up like this. This manipulator here allows us to manipulate an object in three-dimensional space, right? Depending on where I want it to move, I can limit the movement by clicking on the arrow, left-clicking on the arrow, and dragging along that axis. So there we are, we're dragging along the y-axis. Okay, same thing with the x-axis. I can drag along the x-axis. I continue to rotate around. If I press the dot on my keyboard, right, so the period here, I will zoom into the object that I'm looking at, right? Now the thing is, the problem with that is it's not a toggle like the other one is. So I have to kind of zoom out again by kind of scrolling out, right? Again, I'm off center here as an example, and I'm looking at three-dimensional space from a user perspective mode. So perspective mode, my camera is looking at things in a faux three-dimensional reality kind of thing. I'm looking at it in a perspective, right? What we have to differentiate between perspective mode and isographic mode, or kind of looking at it from a 2D or 3D mode. When we look at an object, using an object, if you will, if we play a game in 3D, we might be using a perspective mode. When I am modeling objects, often I'm modeling in orthographic mode, 2D mode. Why? It's easier for me to manipulate objects in 2D a lot of times, and it allows me to do it that way. So again, we just talked about a couple concepts here. The idea of us modeling an object in 3D and the best ways to do that, right? And again, in Blender, there are two modes. There is object mode, which allows me to manipulate an object. So I can click the manipulator arm, move it around. And so according to the axis that I want to move it around in, using the left mouse button, I can only do that if I've selected the object with the right mouse button, right? And if I want to manipulate an object further, I can click the tab key, which takes me into edit mode. Edit mode allows me to now model my object, right? And again, if I was going to do something as simple as subdivide my object, in the left-hand corner here, on the left-hand side, there is a sub-menu that allows me to do more in edit mode. And if you notice, if I flip back to object mode, so this is edit mode, object mode, edit mode, object mode. When I go back into edit mode, if you notice, my menu selections have changed. This is kind of a quick menu that allows me to do some very popular things, very common things to my object. So again, I'm rotating around the object. Everything is selected. You see this orange around the object means that this entire object is selected. It's in select mode. If I press A, the A key, it will deselect everything. A key. Select everything, deselect everything. Right? This is kind of basic selection and deselection. You'll have the same kind of idea whether you use Blender, whether you use Maya, 3D Studio Max, and whatever. Right? So if I want to select things, there are different objects, piece parts of any object that we're going to select. So again, this is review. So what are the three pieces of any polygonal object or any other object that exists in three-dimensional space? Do you guys know? Three parts. Three parts that are what? The vertices, the edges, and the faces, right? Those are the three parts you guys should know about three-dimensional objects, right? So the vertices are these little points where the edges come to a point. That's a vertex. And you can change this by pressing Control-Tab. If I press Control and Tab, I have an option of going to Vertex Select Mode, Edge Select Mode, and Face Select Mode. Okay? Control-Tab. Now again, Blender, Unity, Maya, 3D Studio Max, they all have shortcut keys. You need to know them in order for us to be productive in our pipeline. If you depend on the menus to do your work, it's going to take you forever. So you need to learn the shortcuts, and we're going to go over them over and over again. So again, Control-Tab is what I did to get to that little context menu, right? and I want to click vertex mode, the first one, left click. And now if I click the vertex, I can actually select, if you notice, that vertex, only that vertex is selected, right, between these things. If I want to select multiple vertices or multiple edges, I can shift right click, right, shift right click. Now that I have this, when I move things, I only move those edges. So I can start modeling my object back and forth, you see? So I can do one of these kind of things where I can model my object. So I can do modeling in a very simple way with these primitives. These objects here, the cube, sphere, cone, and so on, these are called object primitives, and they exist in any program that you use. Whether you're using Maya, again, 3D Studio Max, whatever, these primitives are things that exist. Okay, so that's what these are. So you can play around with that. If you only click one, right click one edge or one vertex, you can fool with one vertex. That's pretty cool and all. Not a lot of power though. Let's go into Control Tab and go into edges. So again, edge mode, right clicking the whole edge here, and right click on the edge. And now I left click and I can move this whole thing across one edge. If I press the G button though, it allows me to go kind of free movement. I can kind of move around, up and down, side to side, and so on. I can also move around my edge that way, right? Instead of moving it around with the manipulator arms. Okay? So edge mode. So vertices, edges, and now faces. Control Tab, I can go into face mode, face select mode. And if you notice, when I go into face select mode, I have these little dots in the middle of my faces that allow me to select just the faces that I want to manipulate. Up and down, as an example. I can move them, I can make them, I can grow and shrink my object the way I like. So very, very simple stuff. All right, and if I want to start off, if I want to go back, this is, by the way, I'm in edit mode in order for me to do this. I can't do this stuff in object mode, only in edit mode. How do I get into edit mode again? Really quickly. Tab. Huh? Tab. I was going to say Kyle, tell me. Tab out, so I'm back into object mode. If I press Control N or Command N on the Mac, I can go back and reload my starter file. Let's do that. So start off again, I'm back to this. All right, so again, some basics of Blender. I talked about the three things here as a review. 3 parts of any polygonal object in 3-dimensional space: vertex, edge, and face. You need to know these things because when we talk Unity, I'm going to talk faces, edges, and vertices. And if you don't know this kind of the names, then you're going to like, what is he talking about? Right? Okay. Other things in Blender to note. There's also lighting. So we've got our camera, we've got our mesh. That's what this is called, our mesh model. We've got our light system. Okay. Right now we have a multi-directional light. It's just a point light, if you will, and it's just hovering in 3-dimensional space, if you notice, right? So it provides lighting to light up our model, and our model responds to built-in shaders. I'm going to put it that way for you guys to, I'm going to put it in Unity language now. Built-in shaders to respond to the type of lighting that is being it's responding to or reflecting light or creating shadows based on this 3-dimensional light here that's sitting in 3-dimensional space. Okay? Okay, this is cool, this 3-dimensional light, but you really can't see it. And in Blender, there's different kinds of rendering modes. Okay? The typical rendering mode we see right here is Blender Render. This is the typical Blender Render mode. When you start off Blender, it starts like this. When we play games, there's Blender Game. That allows us to add in logic bricks and add in additional scripting modules to control the game, so because Blender has a built-in game engine, as well as Cycles Render. Cycles Render actually creates a very photorealistic rendering mode. And if you wanted to create logos, if you wanted to do any kind of things similar to After Effects for movies and so on, you could do that with Cycles Render. Even some simple animation and so on. No problem. Actually, even some complex animation. But Cycles Render takes a long time for you to render the object. And we won't be working in Cycles Render for this course. I'm just mentioning because it's a different rendering mode that Blender has. Right? We'll be doing things with Blender Game and Blender Render when we talk Blender at all. Okay? Let's go back into Blender Render for a second. When we go back to Blender Render, this is cool. I'm going to press the N key for a second, the N key. And when I go into there, it gives me a kind of a numeric menu that comes up that allows me to do different things. I want to show you lighting and shadows a little bit. One thing, if you notice, under the shading section of the menu, down here on the bottom, there is a shading mode that says multi-texture. This is great if we're modeling things for non-game objects. Like if I was going to make a game object in Blender and import it into Unity as part of the pipeline, I would never want to use multi-texture. You want to use GLSL mode shading. So let's change this to GLSL. Okay, cool. So now we got GLSL shading. Now there's no apparent change, right? Because we haven't done anything to show that change. But this is a very important step. Whenever we talk about stuff in Blender, we want to use GLSL shading. Okay? Let's take away that sidebar here, this numeric sidebar, by toggling it with the N key. By the way, I can toggle this key, this bar here, this transform bar off with the T key. So T, T, N, N. And I can change my interface to give me more or less room the way I want. Okay? These are important little shortcuts that you need to know. So now I got both the T key, I've got a lot of space here in my 3D view, and I've got my object in three-dimensional space. All right, I want to add another object. Justin, how do I add another object in three-dimensional space? What's the shortcut key? Shift A. And if I use Shift A, I add a mesh. If you notice, there's a little context menu that comes up that asks me to add a mesh. It's going to add in my new object anywhere where my three-dimensional cursor is placed. Right now my three-dimensional cursor is at the origin, which is in the middle of the known universe. Call it that way, right? This is the middle of the universe right now. If I rotate, if you see my three-dimensional cursor, if I move it over here and left click somewhere, now my three-dimensional cursor is over here. If I was to press Shift A, it's going to put my new object where my three-dimensional cursor is. If I want to put my three-dimensional cursor, which happens frequently because people aren't used to left-clicking or right-clicking to select, you'll left-click to select and it won't work, right? In Blender, how do you put it back to the middle? It's Shift S. If you go Shift S, and if you go cursor to center, it'll put it right into the middle of the origin again. Okay? Again, Shift S to move it to center. Okay, so I want to create a new plane, a new primitive. Again, this is another primitive shape. It's a plane. I'm going to go Shift A, and I'm going to go Mesh, Plane. Let's do that. If you notice, the plane sits inside of, I'm just going to kind of zoom in here so you can see, it sits physically inside of the cube, right? You can't see it right now because it's inside the cube. So there's a couple things I can do. I can make the plane larger, which I'm going to do, or I can move the cube up. Let's make the cube, the plane larger. I'm going to click the S key to scale the plane while it's selected, and I'm going to move it way out here so that it takes up my grid, my visible grid. Okay, so now my plane is intersecting my cube. I want to kind of bring my cube up a little bit, so I'm going to right click to select my cube, and I'm going to kind of draw it out of the ground a little bit up here. Okay, there we go. So it's kind of hovering above my plane. Right? Again, three-dimensional space, we've got a cube and a plane. Right now the plane doesn't have anything going on here, and the cube is just sitting there. Okay, I want to see the lighting. How do I see the lighting mode? Like I talked lighting, I just made you guys change to GLSL mode, but I don't see there's no shading or nothing, right? Well, because we're looking at it, if you look at this bottom menu here, I'm going to draw this menu up here, by the way. I'm just going to bring it up so you guys can see it. Here it is. This bottom little menu, right? There is, again, we're in object mode. Here, this area here tells us there's different shading, viewport shading that we allow. When we model basic objects, we either do it in solid mode or we do it in wireframe mode. Wireframe mode is very, very useful because we can actually use, you kind of look at things in a very simplistic way and have more control over what we're doing, right? Again, to shift out of wire mode, to go back into solid mode, you press the Z key, right? If I toggle Z, I can keep toggling wireframe mode to solid mode over and over again. Okay, very important mode. That's why there's a shortcut key for it, right? Okay, let's go back into the shading here, and if I want to see, my shadows and everything else, I want to at least go into material mode, if not rendered mode. Let's go in material mode here for a second. And if you notice now, I'm just going to pull it down so you guys can see this. If you notice now, there are some shadows, but they're all gray. And there's a bit of a reflection here as well. Okay, we're going to talk about these terms. Again, this is all a terminology class. It's not for me to teach you Blender, right? There's lots of tutorials out there to teach you Blender. In fact, if you really want to learn Blender, you can always look back at my course, COMP301. I got tons of little videos that you can go back and take a look at. We're still going to cover a little bit of Blender as a reminder, but more or less, we can't go into the detail that we did with the guys last semester. Okay, so let's just zoom out a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. And if you notice here, I've got a cube and I've got this plane, but they're all gray, right? It's kind of drab gray and everything else. And there's a lot of reflectivity here, which maybe I don't want. Hey, how you doing, my friend? So what do I change here? How do I make this happen? Well, in order for shading to happen, and again, this is going back to 3D theory, if you will, right? The shaders, in order for the shaders to give you any kind of proper shading, you need to have something called materials, right? So again, this is the same thing we're going to talk about in Unity. We need materials in order for us to have the shaders function properly. Now, materials are applied to a shape. Think about a material as a skin, all right? It doesn't necessarily mean that the material has a texture, which is like an image. When I say texture in 3D or 2D, I'm talking images, like ping images, TIFF images, GIF images, whatever. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a material that's a skin that basically is shrink wrapped around our shape, right? That's one of the properties of the shape itself, right? So here's our shape. Both of these things have the default material that's built into Blender when you create an object, right? So if I look at this cube here as an example, right now it has a default material applied to it. Now if you notice on the top here, on this menu, on the sidebar, this menu here has a material button, which looks like a circle, which is the fourth button icon from the right on this side menu, right? You can scroll over to see this. Okay, so here I'm just choosing this button right here. When I do that, it shows me the material, the default material that's built in, and it just says material. That's what it's called. Now, I want to make my object, and people who have been with me from COMP305, forgive me again because I'm going to do the basic, cube, sphere, and plane trick, right? So when we do this, I want to make this object here my player. This is my player cube, right? How do I do this? Well, I need to name this material something, right? So I want to name this material, I'm going to double click here, and I'm going to name this material green. Well, I don't know why I'm naming it green, you might say. Well, because I want to change the color of the material, the color of the skin to green, right? That means that it's going to reflect light to show more green from a shading perspective than any other color. And if you notice down here on the right hand side, underneath my material object, now that I've named it, right, I have some basic functionality here. I have a diffuse property and I have a specular property right here. The diffuse property gives me the color of my object that as it reflects light, right? So if I click on this anywhere in this bar here, it gives me this color wheel that comes up and I can choose what color I want. In this particular case, I want to kind of pull this over here to make it more green. If you want to follow along with me, I can also give you the exact hex values. If you notice here, it goes RGB, HSV, hue saturation, and hex values. My hex value is 33E732 if you want to follow along. So now that I've modified my object's color, I've actually gone away from my default material, right? Now, in Blender, this is all fine and good. When we go into Unity, you're going to have to create a new material for an object, a primitive just like this, if you were going to create a primitive in Unity, right? Okay, there's a couple of other properties here that I have in my material. My green material that I've kind of labeled green has a specularity right now of about 50%, right? That means my object is very shiny. Light will bounce off of it like as if it's a mirror, right? If I want to make it more matte, less shiny, I can reduce the specularity by pulling this bar, left-clicking on the bar, and literally pulling it to the left. So reducing it to 0. So now my material for my green object is matte. There's no specularity for it at all. No reflectivity. That's another way to think about it. Now my ground, my ground is kind of reflective as well. And that doesn't make any sense unless it's like some kind of tiles, a tiled ground or something like that. And right now I want my ground to be like brown, right? Brown. I'm not going to talk any more properties right here for now. I'm going to right click on my ground. This is my ground. Right now it's just a plane. I'm going to right click onto it. And if you notice, there is no default material applied. It's just got the default gray in there. It takes me right into my default material button here. I need to click the new button. The new button will generate a new default material, right? And I'm going to go in here, double click, and change this to brown. So I'm making a new brown skin for the ground, right? I'm going to click diffuse, And I'm going to kind of pull this down into this brown area right here. From a hexadecimal perspective, it's E7, let me see what it was, E79F68, if you want to match what I have. Right? Now the ground can't be reflective like this again, so I'm going to reduce my specularity down to 0. All right, why am I doing this? Not because I want to play with you guys, but because I need you guys to know two things. There's materials that are skins around objects, right? They handle the shading property of an object, right? And furthermore, they have a couple of properties. Right now, I've only mentioned 2 of them. The diffuse property, or the color property, if you will. In other programs, it's called color, right? And the specularity property, specular property, which is the reflectivity. I've reduced reflectivity to 0 in both examples. Okay, cool. So I've got a couple objects. Well, here in my outliner, if you notice on the right-hand corner here, on the top right hand, I have my objects. And right now, this is my organization or my hierarchy for my objects. In Unity, you're going to have a hierarchy as well. And this is my object hierarchy right now. I have a plane, I have a cube, I have a lamp, I have a camera, right? My plane doesn't make any sense. I want to rename this by double-clicking and calling it ground, right? I want to double-click on my cube and call this thing player, right? There we go, player and ground. How about the enemy, right? We got the player, we need the enemy now, right? So I'm going to rotate my object so I can see it in 3-dimensional space. And if you notice here, I've got my manipulator arm that shows my X value on this axis and my Y value here, as well as my Z value this way. I want to kind of, change the way I'm viewing things right now. So just try and match up your view with mine. Okay? Cool, cool. Right? Again, if you're behind and if you wanted to do this, if you wanted to scale up your plane, it's the S key to scale up your plane to as big as possible. And by the way, there's guys around. If you don't know if you see someone struggling, help them out, right? Because we want to move on with this kind of stuff. Okay, so we've got a few options here. We've got these different objects. I want to create one more object. It's going to be a sphere, right? But before I do that, I want to move my object here, my player object, kind of downwind, right? So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to take the manipulator arm with the green arrow, and I'm going to move this down so it's kind of hanging out down here. There it is. And here's my light. Take a look at what my light does. If I move my light around, it actually lights up the scene a little bit differently. I can apply lighting to the scene according to where my point lamp exists in 3-dimensional space. All right, let's add in, and again, my cursor is at origin. If yours is not at origin for some reason, again, you can press Shift-S and set cursor to center your cursor again, right? I want to create another object. I want to press Shift-A to create another object and create a sphere. Now there's 2 different spheres in Blender. One of them is a UV sphere, which is a high poly sphere, and there's a low poly sphere called an icosphere, right? Poly means polygons. Low poly, low polygons. The less polygons, the less draw it has on CPU resources, right? We want to be able to use low poly resources when we're modeling for our games because it takes less resources and our games are more responsive. Not responsive as in responsive web design responsive. I mean faster, right? Okay, so let's click on the UV sphere anyway, make it a high poly sphere, and if you notice, it's kind of embedded in our plane again. I want to kind of draw the sphere out. I'm going to zoom into it first, and I'm going to grab the blue manipulator arm, the Z manipulator arm, and kind of pull it out. All right? Now, if you notice right now, the sphere has a lot of little edges. I'm going to press the T key to toggle in my transformation menu again. And if you notice on the left hand of the transformation menu, there's a smooth button. You can click the smooth button, which makes the sphere nice and smooth now, right? Now, question, does the sphere have a material on it? Does the sphere have a material on it? The answer is no. It has a default material that's applied by Blender. In Unity, there is no default material that you can really use to do anything with. You need to create a material, right? So, and same thing with Blender. So now if you notice, on the right, there is this new button because I've clicked on the sphere, right-clicked on the sphere. I got to click the new button to create a new material. I'm going to left-click. All right, now I'm going to rename the material red. Okay, there's my red enemy, right? And but my memory is not read yet. I got to change it by clicking on the diffuse property, right, the color property, and moving the color value into the red field here. Yes, you're good? All right, so my hexadecimal value is E73858 if you want to match up what I have. It's kind of a deeper red, right? If I want to make it a brighter red, again, I can move up this value here, which is actually kind of, you can actually dull an object down and make it brighter, depending on how much hue and saturation you want to apply to the object, right? Or else I can also move this up into the middle if I want to make it brighter or duller, more orange or more purple. You know, again, the color wheel does a great job of doing that. Or I can move it right to the edge to make it really red. Okay, let's do that. So now, I want my specularity in this case to be really specular. I want it to be like super reflective. So let's do that. Let's add my intensity. I want to go the other way this time and make my object super specular or super reflective. And if you notice there's a bit of a shine that you're going to see here in my object. And depending on where my light source is, as I move it around, you can see that the object shines now or reflects my light source, right? And as I move my viewport around in three-dimensional space, viewport, another word that we're going to know a lot, is our viewport shader here is showing that here's the light source and there's a direct reflection from the light source onto our shape based on the material that's skinned around it to provide the shader. See what I'm saying? You need to know these terms. Otherwise, you know, when we talk about in Unity, you're going to be like, whoa. Okay. And again, I'm assuming that you don't know anything, so please forgive me if I'm going all crazy on you. All right, we got one more thing to do before we stop. We need to change my sphere. And it can't be called sphere. It's got to be called, from a context perspective, it should be called enemy. So we got our enemy, we got our player, we got our lamp, and we've got our ground. Okay, our lamp right now, if you notice, is an energy level of 1, and this is a point type lamp. We can also change our lamp, if you notice here. If I click on the lamp, right click on the lamp to select it. Down here on the lamp selection mode here, on the lamp, we have different options. If I click on sun, there's something different happens, right? See how it lights up? Sun. If I click on spot, it becomes a spotlight. If I click on hemi, it's a hemisphere. And you got to be careful because sometimes, I mean, depending on where the hemi is pointed, it looks almost like it's bright or brighter than a sun. Then there's the area lamp, which is only around the area, depending on the space of the lamp itself, or the strength of the lamp and where it's pointing right now. If you notice it's pointing right down there, it doesn't light anything up just because of the way it's been pointed. Okay, so let's go back to point for a second. So it's kind of dull. If I want to increase the strength of the lamp, if you notice here, there's an energy level for the lamp, or for the emitter. Hint, hint, emitter, right? I am emitting light. I'm raycasting, if you will, right? I've got this lamp that's emitting light, and my shader is reflecting the light because my shader, which is this material right now, material shader, has both specularity, reflectivity, as well as color, right? Those are the things that it has. All right. So that's the kind of stuff that it does. Okay, cool. I can increase this. Let's increase this value to 2 and see what it does. It increases the brightness of my point lamp. If I move my point lamp closer to my object, like right towards it, you get a lot more reflectivity nearest the object and more shading and shadows away from the object. Okay, cool. Let's press the 0 button on our numpad again to go into our camera mode. This is what we see in the camera. So when we're playing the game, if you notice, it's kind of, our camera is not really positioned correctly, is it? Right? I don't want my camera to be here. I want my camera to kind of look at it, if I was playing the game, from this angle, right? Like kind of in the top. When I say game, I want to have my square, here's my cube, I want my cube to push around my sphere, right? As an example. So how do I do that? So I want my angle, my camera to be here. Well, there is an option. If I go to View, my View menu, which is right here, by the way. I'm going to pull it up so you can see right here where I'm pointing. View menu. If I go to the View, and if I go to Align View, and if I go Align Active Camera to View, then my camera is moved right to where I'm looking at right now. And I can increase the size of my camera by doing another little trick. First, I'm going to press the T button to toggle that off. and I'm going to press the N button to bring back my numeric transform menu on the right hand side, right? And what I want to do is inside here there's another option that says lock camera to view. I want to click on that. And what I want to do is I want to scroll out. And now what I'm actually doing is I'm moving my camera so that its position is wherever I've moved my, wherever I scroll. Now I want to unclick that lock camera to view, and I want to scroll in, so this is what my camera is going to see. And now this is a much better view for my scene. Hey, I just said something. I said scene. Scene, and there's another thing you need to know when we program things in Unity, right? Right now, my scene up here is called scene. Let's rename this thing and call it main up here. Here's my main scene. I'm going to double click and call this thing main, our main scene. This is the main scene of the game, if you will. I can have multiple scenes. They're just container objects that contain other objects. My scene can contain my game, my player, my enemy, my ground, my clouds, my sky, my bullets. It can contain everything. That's my scene. It's a complete game container, right? I can have multiple scenes. I can have a scene that's my opening screen, my opening credits, if you will, and my opening, welcome screen or whatever. I can have a scene that's my exit screen or my end screen, my game over screen. I can have a scene that's a transition screen that goes from one gameplay screen to another. I can have multiple scenes. I can transition in different parts of my game world. When I collide with another object, that can transition from one part of my game world to another. What I'm really doing is moving from one scene into another scene, right? Showing different parts of my game, right? So a scene is a unit that's a container that contains the game world, okay? And in this particular case, I also have something else. I'm just going to zoom away from this thing. I just clicked lock camera to view. I clicked away lock camera to view to do this. If you notice in Blender and in other systems as well, you have not just scenes but layers, right? And I can continue on with this thing, and I can continue to go crazy with this. But as you can see, there's tons and tons of stuff that when we're going to talk about three-dimensional space and so on, there's things you need to know when we talk, when I talk about different things. I'm going to repeat myself a lot, right? So don't fret, don't worry. If you sit there and go, man, I didn't have Tom last semester for 391, and now I feel behind. You're not behind, right? This is exactly what we would normally do if you never took this course, because this course, what requirements does this course have? COMP305, I believe, or COMP100. I forget, one of the two. It does not have COMP391 as a requirement, right? Which means I have to really talk about this three-dimensional stuff again. So don't worry. If you took it, all the power to you. If you didn't take it with me, it's okay. It's not a bad thing. We're going to continue to talk this stuff until I make you sick. So don't worry. All right? For some of you are getting worried about, oh my God, there's a million controls and I'm never going to learn Blender. You're not going to learn Blender anyway. This is not a Blender course. This is, a Unity course, but we need to know about three-dimensional space, and that's why I'm going into this detail, because I'm going to say the same things over and over again. Okay, one more thing in Unity. If I want to have some kind of gaming, anything going on with gaming, in Unity I need to be able to collide with other shapes. In Blender, there isn't so much a collider. A collider, the name collider is really a Unity name, right? So we can kind of create a collider, if you will, in Blender, but the only way I can do that is if I move from Blender render to Blender game. Let's do that. Let's move from Blender render to Blender game now. All right, and if you notice, there's no difference in our viewport. Our 3D view, when I've changed rendering modes, is exactly the same, right? Pretty much, right? But what it did do when I moved from those modes, I'm just going to click off the N button here so you can see more of my screen. On the right-hand side, if I click I'm just right-click my player, and if I click the very last icon here on the right, it gives me almost like my physics. Well, remember, in game, we have game physics. Right now, my object is a static object, right? Which means static object in three-dimensional space it just sits there, does not being affected by gravity. Okay? Easy way to think about this. Let's make our physics edge object for our player, this green cube. Let's make it a dynamic object. Now there's different options here. Let's just make it dynamic for now. And let's do the same thing for my red sphere, my enemy. I want to make this a dynamic object. So I've changed these properties here. And let's just, for dramatic effect, let's just kind of raise my sphere and push it over a little bit, you know, kind of over here and a little bit higher, right? And I'm just going to change kind of the perspective of my screen. Okay, cool. Without making any other changes, right? I want you to press the P button, right, on your keyboard. Bam, right? Okay, let's press Escape to get out of that. Press P, and bam, right? And if something wrong happened on your screen, we'll go around and make sure you know how to do it later on, and kind of under a break. But if you notice what I just did there, when I use P, I'm in play mode, right? Blender has a play mode because Blender has a game engine built in, and we can do simulations with Blender, right, to kind of get accustomed to the three-dimensional world by doing this. Now this is cool and all, but that was pretty darn slow, right? In game, we want to kind of increase the gravity a lot more than that. So how do I do that? Well, there's other buttons here that give us different options. So if I click on this other option here, which looks like another sphere, and if you notice, my gravity, this is the world, I can affect the entire world. My gravity, again, I'm using bullet physics, that's the engine I have. I have two other different, I can also import in Blender different kind of physics engines, but by default, bullet is the basic physics engine. I want to change my gravity to 30. So instead of 9.8 meters per second squared, I want to change to 30 meters per second squared. So really crazy gravity, right? Why? Because in games, things happen a lot faster. They drop a lot quicker. If I let things drop at 9.8 meters per second squared in a real game, it's going to float. It's going to look like it's going to float. It's too slow. So let's check this out now. So I've changed it to 30 and press P. Bam, it's much faster now, right? Because gravity is really pulling down on my object. Okay. So what have I done? I've created a material. My material, right, can be affected by gravity. I don't have a material. I can't be affected properly by gravity in Unity. I need material to skin my object, and then I need to create a collider, right? And there's two types of colliders in Unity. There's a 2D collider and a 3D collider, which we're going to see soon, right? In Blender, the collider is built in. As soon as I go from Blender render to Blender game, every object has a basic box collider. And if you notice here, if I click on the right-hand side here for my sphere, right? And if I go scroll down, if you notice I haven't defined collision bounds, but under my game menu on the top part here, if I want to show, right, physics visualization, okay, so turn that on, that checkbox, so show physics visualization, right? And if I press P, right, you can see how my game now has a square or a cube around my sphere. Why is this bad? I'm going to ask you again. Why is this bad? You're in front of me and you got a tie on, so I got to ask somebody, right? Why is this bad for me to have my sphere with a cube around it? Is that accurate? No.
It's circular, so it won't give accurate representation
right.
of the collision.
So if I want my sphere to roll, I got to give it some kind of other type of collider, right? Now there are other types of colliders I can give it. So if I press Escape and I go back and I scroll down here, if I can click collision bounds, I click onto that. If you notice, there's a box collider here. I don't want a box collider. I want a sphere collider, right? So I click on sphere, and now it hugs the object, right? Now again, a sphere collider, although it seems more complex than a cube, and it will be in Unity, you'll notice from a CPU utilization perspective, cube collider is the most simple collider there is, right? And sometimes we use that because it makes life simple, right? But sphere collider is still a primitive type of collider, and it's still good to use. Things we want to avoid: any kind of mesh colliders. If you have a mesh collider, or if you have any kind of convex collider or anything like that, that wraps around your object really, really beautifully, we want to kind of avoid that because it adds to the CPU utilization in our game. And if you have many objects like that, it'll really, kind of bog down our game world. Okay, let's see what it does now. So here's our sphere. I'm going to press P for play and then see what happens. Wait, what happened? How come it's a square again? Well, I said it was supposed to be a sphere. How come? Well, actually it is. Its representation is my collider. If you notice, my collision bounds is a sphere, right? But I still have this square object around it, right? From a representational perspective. If I change my sphere collider, right? Now this is where it goes crazy, to a convex hull, right? Let's try this. And if I press P, Now take a look at it. It's so much more complex. It's hard to see, but you can see all these little points there. That's crazy. You don't want that, right? Here's something else, right? Right now, everything is, let's go back to, I'm going to change this back to sphere collider for a second, okay? My sphere collider is there. It hasn't rolled or done anything. How come it's not rolling? Well, because the way it fell, right? Here's the other thing. There's some other properties you can notice as well. If we go back to the material icon, which is the fourth one from the right, here's our material icon. And if you scroll down, there's also another physics section down here. This one has friction, elasticity. Forget force field for now. Let's just do elasticity. Right now our elasticity is 0, which means there's no bounce. If I increase my elasticity to 0.5, let's do that. Let's go all the way to 0.5 for the elasticity. You can also type it in. So I want to go to 0.5. I can kind of erase it and go 0.5, right, for my sphere. And if I press P for play, it kind of, boom, nothing happens, right? Okay, what if I do the same thing for my ground? Right-click on my ground. I change my elasticity to 0.5, right? And I go back and press play, and now let's see what happens. Oh, there's a bit of a bounce, right? And if I want more of a bounce, let's go more of a bounce. I'm going to change my elasticity here, you know, to, instead of 0.5, we're going to go to 0.75, so really elastic. Oops. If I type properly, how about that? 0.75. And same thing with my sphere. Let's change this to 0.75 and see what happens. All right, so elasticity is high, press P for play, and now we get a bit of a bounce, right? Still no motion. It's not moving anywhere because the way it's been laid out. Okay, escape. Let's do this thing here. I'm going to right-click on my plane, and now I'm going to do one more thing. I'm just going to rotate it over here. I want to transform it. I want to rotate it across the x-axis 10 degrees. Let's see how we can do this. I'm going to press R for rotate across the x-axis and press X now to limit it across the x-axis and rotate it 10 by pressing I'm just putting 10 in. 10. Like 1, 0. So I'm rotating across the x-axis 10 degrees. Okay, so now it looks like this, right? And if I go back to my regular view and I press P for play, I have not only a rotating sphere, but a bit of an angle, right? Okay, if you notice here what's happened, even though, and that's why I wanted to show you my physics visualization, take a look. Even though my physics on my object is the way it is, right? I have a square that's physically appearing around my plane, right? Even though I've rotated it, the computer has to interpret it somehow, right? So what the computer likes to do, computer visualization of physics, it likes to box things up and create boxes around objects so they can understand where they exist in three-dimensional space, right? Okay, one thing we didn't do is we didn't add a box collider or any kind of collider around my ground. Typically we don't do that. But let's do that now. Let's right-click on or left-click on the right side here for the physics. And in here I want to create a collision bounce. Right, there's my collision bounce. And right now there's a box collider around everything. Okay, cool. Let's press P for play and see what happens. So a bit of motion here, and my box collider still seems to be around. Still a static object. What happens if I don't make this a static object? What happens to the ground? Let's take a look. Let's try that out. So I'm going to escape, and I'm going to go from here, and I'm going to go back into instead of static, I'll make it dynamic. Let's see what that happens. If I do this, this is cool and all, but what happens is everything falls down into oblivion, right? Sometimes you'll see that happening in Unity, right? Why? Because objects haven't been aligned properly. If you want your ground to be steady, you don't want it to be affected by gravity. And you got to turn gravity off, right? Let's go back to static. Hey, by the way, something to note here about Blender, right? I'm describing three-dimensional world in Blender, right? But one thing that Blender has, or the Unity has that Blender doesn't have, is I can modify things in-game. When I press play, equivalent in Unity, I can actually interface with the game and change the values as I go on to debug the game. I can't do that in Blender. Right? I can't change the values when it's in play mode. It's set. Once it's set, it's set. It's not like that in Unity. You have more control. We're going to get to Unity in the second half of today, right? But first of all, I want just you to kind of see this. One more thing before we go on. Right now, my sphere is a dynamic body. If I want to make it roll, I can change this from dynamic to rigid. Let's make it to a rigid body. And let's see what happens to my sphere now. Let's press play. All right, now my sphere rolls around, right? And it'll roll off the screen, right? It actually bounced into my object here. Let's try that again. And let's position my sphere so that it's right in front of my cube. Let's try this out, P. So it's rolling down and bam, it pushes everything off into oblivion, right? So what have I done here? I've actually created a simulation of what it would be like to bounce a ball equivalent across the screen and let it bounce and collide with my object to roll off the screen, right? It's a simulation. I'm using my physics engine, the Bullet physics engine. By the way, same Bullet physics engine is being used by Unity and Unreal as an engine. There's others. Those are the two most common ones, or the one that's most common, I mean. I've talked about rigid bodies. I've talked about static bodies. I've talked about dynamic bodies, right? These are different physics terms you need to know when we talk about things in Unity, right? So physics at a very high level, right? One thing we also talk about in Unity a lot is vectors. Now, if you're not familiar with vector math, what's a vector? Anyone have an idea? I'm putting it out there, and then I'll pause for a break because you guys are getting killed, right? I'm killing you with the terms, right? And all this kind of stuff. And it's dark too, so it's perfect sleeping, kind of environment, right? Okay, I'm gonna ask the guy with the tie again. What's the vector, right? He showed up with a tie, so it's his fault. Next, I'm gonna talk to you. We have to switch places next time. I'll ask you what. What was that?
So we'll wear a tie next time.
Come on, talk to me about what's a vector. So if I want to, here's a quick hint. If I want to kind of impose a vector, right, on an object, what am I doing to it? What am I giving the object? What am I imparting to it?
Position, location.
I change my position, right? And what do I give it? A vector does what? There, I'll give you a chance.
Direction and speed.
Direction and speed. It's actually the direction, and it has a, not a, sorry, it's a, what the hell is it called now? I'm killing myself, right? It's got a size, right? So the bigger, the more velocity I give in my vector, if you're looking in 2D space only has x and y. If I add a vector to 2D space to go across the x-axis, I'm only translating across the x-axis. The challenge is when I'm translating across all three axes, right? X, y, and z. That means I need a three-dimensional vector, right? There's a vector 2 in Unity, and there's a vector 3 in Unity. In order for me to transform an object from one position to another, when in scripting mode, I need to use a vector 3, which means I need to part direction and distance that I'm moving an object across three-dimensional space. Okay? So what's happening here, if I press P again, the physics engine is imparting energy, if you will, to the object in a particular direction in order for the physics simulation to go. That's what it's doing. It's falling. The physics engine is working automatically. I don't have to do anything because it's working, but it's imparting distance and direction. There's one other thing I've got to talk about with what just happened with my rigid body. It spun. Spinning is imparting an angle, right? And that's called, in Unity, I hate to say this again, you're going to kill me, a quaternion, right? Right? We're going to talk about this, right? And what it does is it imparts not just speed and direction, but angle across three-dimensional space. So that's what's happening here. When the ball falls, it's going across three-dimensional space. It's got some energy that it's getting from gravity, right? And then what's happening is as it's coming there, it's spinning, it's moving because the type of collider, the type of physics that's on this particular material is a rigid body, right? It's identifying it as a rigid body. The physics engine is saying, okay, if it's a rigid body, it has to spin. There's got to be some angle attached to the motion as it falls. Okay? I think that's a good stopping place for now. I might have killed you guys all, but I appreciate the patience, and we'll go right into Unity after this.